Lee and I were talking on the way home this morning about how things in our culture are in such a situation of flux that it's hard to pin down a lot of things, hard to even keep up with the various vocabularies that are used to describe certain things that are wrong. I was also thinking about a conversation I think I had with Sister Janet last week after Sunday night services, that years ago when I first started preaching, I never would have dreamed I would need to even talk about subjects that we're trying to talk about in this little series of Christianity and our culture. When I began to preach, there was no such things as HIV or AIDS, at least it hadn't been discovered at that time. And homosexuality was, you knew it was there, but it was so unheard of as to be a non-issue, at least among Christians. And things have changed. I was thinking also about several other matters that when you talk about what the Bible says about the various roles in our male, female, or gender, you can say what the Bible says in probably 10 minutes. You could read through what the New Testament says are the responsibilities of men as well as women. And yet people make a mess out of that, and it takes a long time to try to clear all that up. So we've been talking about Christianity and our culture, and we talked back in the latter part of last month about the standards for morality that a lot of people use and what we should use. We talked on the 10th or the 3rd of this month about abortion, and then on the 10th of this month we talked about drunkenness and social drinking. And then last week we talked about the different roles of men and women and how that's being perverted. We dealt some with homosexuality. And tonight I want to deal with the transgender movement. A lot of things to say about it, but I would like for us to think first about how the devil was and is the father of lies. Jesus called him the father of lies in Genesis the 8th, in John the 8th chapter, verse 44. And we see that all the way back in Genesis 3 with Adam and Eve. He mixed lies with half-truths that somewhat were believable. And so the devil was and is the father of lies, and he continues. Adam and Eve's hearing him and heeding his word led to their expulsion from the garden. It led to their separation from God and eventual death. And the same is going on today. Nothing has really changed from that time. I believe it is difficult, at least it's difficult for me, to imagine more lies being foisted on the American public than there has ever been, any more so than from the transgender movement, and their accomplices in the liberal wings of government as well as major media outlets. I don't know of a time in my life where when I turn on the news, and I hear people talking, especially from the transgender, that there's one lie after another, and very little is done about that. Unfortunately, this whole movement has, I am convinced from different things I've read and from what you see, it has as its ultimate agenda the overthrow of marriage and the family as God describes it. And it is rooted outside of reality. The very fact that we are born either a male or female and our gender is known by our sex, they try to separate those two. It's not even in reality. And from that point of view, it's all based on a lie. I want to take a few minutes right now at the very beginning and talk a little bit about the history of this movement. And I believe it can go back to at least 200 years when the classical liberals in Germany were denying the inspiration of the Bible, denying that Moses wrote the Pentateuch and that there were the various authors, and then they really were denying the inspiration of the Bible and denying that Israel was actually a family to whom God had given special laws that the law of Moses was nothing special. It was just a kind of a reflection of some of the mores of their society. So they were denying the Bible, and that came on into England, and then it came over in our country in the 19th century. And so we had seminaries that were producing preachers in various denominations who were denying the miracles of the Bible, the virgin birth, the resurrection. I saw, so this is not really on the transgender movement, but I saw 2 or 3 years ago some statistics on Methodism and how many Methodist bishops actually believed in the resurrection. And very few. I had a professor at Athens State, when it was Athens State College, Dr. Daniel Jones, and he was a very kind-hearted man. He was good to me in a lot of ways. But he was asked in class one time, "Do you believe in the virgin birth of Christ?" He said, "No." He was asked, "Do you believe in the resurrection of Jesus?" He said, "Yes." And the question was raised, why that and not the other? Because so much of Paul's epistles are based on the resurrection. It's kind of a conglomeration. It's just you kind of pick and choose what you believe. But if you disbelieve the inspiration of the Scripture, then there's no reason really to believe in the God of the Bible. And without believing in the God of the Bible, we come back to Romans 1 and what happens to a society that refuses to have God in their knowledge. I made the point before that what happens to human beings actually, from a moral point of view and just the behavioral, will fall below animals. And the reason is animals have instinct. They are inbred with instinct. Man does not have that. So if he has absolutely no standard to which he adheres, then behaviorally, morally, he will fall below the animal creation because they at least have that. Well, this denial of the Bible and its inspiration has given rise to belief that our manhood and womanhood are incidental. They're simply minor or secondary, and they don't have that much to do with who we are. And this opposes Bible teaching that life is a gift from God, as Paul said on Mars Hill, that we are responsible to God for using our bodies as he says. In 1 Corinthians 6:19 and 20, we are not our own. Paul says we were bought with a price, therefore glorify God in our bodies. And our bodies are the dwelling place of the Holy Spirit. Again, we're not our own. But people think, yeah, our body is mine. It's mine to do with whatever I want to do with it. And so it's simply incidental to our being. Furthermore, whatever our strengths or weaknesses are in our bodies, the Bible teaches we are to practice self-control and use them for God's glory and for the purposes that he specifically states. We're to present our bodies as a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is our spiritual service. The Bible, medical professionals, and common sense have known for years that we, and what I mean by we, men and women, males and females, are different anatomically. Genesis 2:23 shows that. We're different in ability. We're different in our roles to procreate. We're different in hormones, in testosterone. We're different emotionally. And in many other ways, we are different. And our weaknesses, the weaknesses of one sex, are often the strengths of the other. In 1 Peter 3, verse 7, husbands are taught to keep in mind that the wife is the weaker vessel and to treat her accordingly, that our prayers be not hindered, that she is a joint heir of the grace of life. And so she's not emotionally or spiritually weaker, but physically, generally speaking, physically she is weaker. And we've seen that with just recently the swimmer who transitioned or transgendered from being a male to a female, and he's beating all these female swimmers. It's not even competitive. And that's because the bone structure, the general makeup, generally speaking, of males is stronger than females. And the Bible acknowledges that, and people of common sense have acknowledged that. And yet, while that's true, each complements the other. It's not good for man to be alone. I will make a help suitable for him. This is what we talked about last week. And neither is the man without the woman or the woman without the other or without the man in the Lord. There is the mutual need for the opposite sex that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 11. And surgeries, in order to become transgender on preferences of gender, cannot change these constants. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But if someone wants to get some kind of surgical operation, changes the genitalia, that doesn't mean that he's changed all over. In fact, he's not changed at all except in that instance. Everything else concerning the chromosomes are the same as when he was born or when she was born. I didn't say they were born, he or she, because that's what he or she is. And how have classical liberals and deniers of God and the inspiration moved so rapidly? Well, I think there are at least three phases that have come, and I want to talk with those with you about in a general sense to start with. Feminism and the sexual revolution of the 60s, and really since that time, have refashioned a different world. They've transformed the home. Men have lost their responsibility, or they have abdicated their responsibility for family. They've become, to a large degree, more passive, self-absorbed, self-focused, rather than being the man of the house and being the responsible party for the wife and any children who are brought into the world because of his relation with her. They've abdicated. To a large degree, men have abdicated that. And the sexual revolution has really given vent for that there's no covenantal side of marriage. But feminism, I believe, in the sexual revolution of the 60s have brought all of that in. Then the second part of that phase is that the spread of the homosexual movement, led by celebrities in the 80s, especially the late 80s, has just fostered that. The movement was built from the momentum of the feminist push and the sexual revolution of the 60s. It sought to mainstream homosexual behavior, assumes men and women are not different in any meaningful ways, and that the moral constraints have already been removed. Romantic love was not subject to any shape or design, just a feeling. There are no duties, no covenantal sides, no commitment. So if it feels good, do it, and then whatever the consequences are, that's okay. And so all those moral restraints have been removed, which leads to the transgender movement ideology, based on the thought that our body is not an essential part of our being, and the gender identity can be fluid. It's whatever we want it to be. So reconstructive surgery allows the body to fit whatever identity a person or persons desire. And quite frankly, from what I have read from what I consider reliable sources, a lot of this has to do with the homosexual and lesbian agenda. That if here is the desire to have a homosexual relation or a lesbian relation, someone has to be active, someone has to be passive. And so the genitalia and the surgeries, all of that can allow for some of that. And it's pretty horrid. The role play with various sex partners is a part of the equation. When you come to this, it's not one party for life. It's just as many as people would want. Any sexual practice imaginable would be acceptable. That's a part of all this transgender movement. Whatever you want to do, however you want to do it, with whomever you would like to do it is fine. And so you do whatever you want to do, and you become whatever you want to become to fit all that. Now, I want us to talk specifically just for a moment about some of the founding fathers of the movement. Specifically, the founding fathers of the transgender movement began as the brainchild of three men who shared a common bond. All of them were pedophilia activists. Dr. Alfred Kinsey, you've probably heard of the Kinsey research and all of that in the 40s and the 50s. He believed all sex acts were legitimate, including pedophilia, bestiality, sadomasochism, incest, adultery, prostitution, group sex. All of that was A-OK with him. He authorized experiments on infants. He advocated normalization of pedophilia. And the experiments that he performed on infants who may have had some abnormalities in their birth that have come out in later years or horrendous. Not a lot of that is brought out, and there's a good reason why not a lot of that is brought out, and it's the finding of information on the, quite frankly, learning about some of the background of the transgender movement is difficult to find. You would think if it's just such broadly accepted and everything's okay, that the history of that would be wide open, but it's not, and for good reasons. Furthermore, Kinsey added transsexualism to his repertory. When an effeminate boy wanted to become a girl, he consulted the second of the three, Dr. Harry Benjamin, who offered female hormone therapy to the boy. And that was, then the boy went to Germany and there was lost contact. A third co-founder was psychologist Dr. John Money, a disciple of Kinsey and member of a transsexual research team headed by Dr. Benjamin. Money's first transgender case was in 1967 when a Canadian couple, last name was Raymer, asked him to repair a botched circumcision on their 2-year-old son, whom they had named David. Well, Dr. Money, without any kind of medical justification, told David's parents that there were problems, and to ensure little David's happiness, what they needed to do was surgically change him from a male to a female and raise him as a girl. And they, like a lot of parents, we take the doctor knows more than we do. We'll just take him at his word. So they complied, and David became Brenda. Money assured the parents that Brenda would never know the difference, and said, though, that they should keep what had been done a secret, which they did for a while. Well, David, or Brenda, grew up, and Money reported that what he had done was a success to the medical community, but it would be a number of years before the truth about all this was revealed. David's adaptation to being a girl was completely different from what Money had reported. It was not a success. By the age of 12, David was depressed. He refused to see Dr. Money for any follow-up visits. The parents broke their secrecy. And by the age of 14, after more surgery, he chose to live as a boy. He was depressed and wanted to go back to what he actually was born as. In the year 2000, at 35 years of age, David and his twin brother exposed sexual abuse by Dr. Money, and which he had inflicted on them. He had taken nude pictures of them, had them engaged in sodomy. It was just a number of things that had gone unreported until later. By 2003, David's twin, Brian, overdosed and he died, basically committed suicide. And shortly after that, David committed suicide as well. Those are not really great results of any kind of transgender surgery. Dr. Money became a co-founder of one of the first university-based gender clinics at Johns Hopkins University. However, Dr. Paul McHugh, director of psychiatry and behavioral science, wanted more long-term evidence than what Dr. Money was just refuted to have. And so he assigned Dr. John Meyer 50 people, 50 subjects, both from those who had undergone gender reassignment surgery and those who had not had surgery. And the result, especially after a few years, was that Money's claims were refuted. There was no medical necessity for any surgery. It had not helped, rather it had harmed. It had done more harm than it had done good. By 1980, the Johns Hopkins Gender Clinic closed because of the problems that had come from it. Numerous suicides were reported among the surgically transgendered. And so all of that was the background. It was the background in pedophilia. It was the background in pseudoscience, pseudomedicine, and it ended in botched surgeries, and a lot of people committed suicide. Well, moving a little from that, if a person can change the vocabulary, just like, for instance, instead of pro-abortion or killing a baby, we're pro-choice. Well, that sanitizes what it really is. It euphemizes it. It makes something that, and we do that all the time. You know, instead of somebody died, they passed away. Passed away is a euphemism for death. Some of them are not bad. But when you take sins like adultery and we'll say, well, we just had an affair, that's a euphemism. It's kind of making something that's very unpleasant or bad not sound so bad. And that's exactly what's happened with the transgender movement. Kathy Albasa, who's Vice President of Institutional and Sectoral Change at the racial justice nonprofit group known as Race Forward, states, you can't change what you can't name. You can't change what you can't name. Well, so we're going to name something, give it a name, give it a pejorative name that people won't want to be a part of, and then we'll vilify it, and then we'll accuse people of being guilty of it, and so we'll divide and conquer. That's the idea. The strategy is to create issues such as systemic racism or transphobia or homophobia and divide the world into oppressors and oppressed. You got two groups of people and group or categorize them around that issue, then engage in disruptive protest until their demands are met. It's pretty smart, really. These people are not dumb. They're just evil. That's all it is to it. They know what they're doing, and their device is to try to divide people, accuse them of things they're not guilty of, that is, good people, accuse them of things they're not guilty of them, and then have a vocabulary that attaches words that really aren't true, and then accuse them of that, and you have to prove your innocence rather than they prove your guilt. And so they weaponize language and their vocabulary. That's a part of their strategy. The woke speak, the idea of inclusive, that's used in so much, inclusive. And the use of they to replace he or she as the proper singular pronoun. You know, when you got to have an agreement, or supposed to have grammatically, an agreement between a noun and its pronoun. If you have Sally over here, it's not they, it's she. It's a singular pronoun that goes with a singular noun. And the transgender people are just as far off or farther off on their grammar as they are their Bible and anything else. You don't put a plural pronoun with a singular noun. It's just, and yet that's what they do in an effort in their vocabulary to try to mix up and confuse the issue. Mother is out. Birthing person is in. Mother harkens back to a female, to male, female, to the so-called binary sexes. Merriam-Webster named the word they as the word of the year 3 years ago. That's the word of the year. And it's so sad to me that a source like Merriam-Webster's dictionary that all of us have used time and time again can come out and be a part of this movement and agree that the word they is fine to be used for singular nouns. You know, read recently, somebody asked a question, well, can Christians compromise, and if a person who is a male and he wants to be considered a female, should you call him by the female name her or she? And the truth of the matter is, we are to speak the truth on everything. And just because a person is a male and wants to be a female does not make the person a female. He's still a male. He is still a male. Or if a female wants to be a male, that doesn't make her a male just because she wants to be the preferred. One other thing along this idea of the vocabulary that I don't have on the chart is the idea with the he, she, the gender, and the pronouns and the use of all of that when we speak the truth and either identify a person as a he or she, and they don't want that, they want they, or they prefer something that they're not, then what's that to keep me? What if I said, well, you know, I want to be I want to be a dog, or I want to be a horse. I want to be a cow. And I don't want you to call me by a human name. I want you to call me, what's the difference in that? It is completely out of the realm of reality. It's past common sense. Lee and I were talking just this afternoon about the idea. She said, I remember when we were kids and my cousins would come, we would play school. And I'd be the teacher and they would be the students. Or we would play like we were animals and, we'd get out on all four. But as soon as Mama would say, supper's ready, we knew what we were. We didn't go to the trough, we went to the table. We knew what we were. It's just common sense. But that common sense is abdicated on all of this. Well, when you look at how they define things, gender, they say the sex, the feminine gender, the behavioral, cultural, or psychological traits typically associated with one sex, grammatical classification of nouns, pronouns, or other words in noun phrases, especially a distinction related to the sex of the referent. If inanimate, neuter, gender, subclass. In grammar, you either have masculine, feminine, or neuter. And it has to do with the sex. It's not something that you just, prefer. Transgender defined is of or relating to or being a person who identifies with or expresses a gender identity that differs from the one which corresponds to the person's sex at birth. Well, that's whatever you are is what I was thinking about. You see, you hear this phrase. Their sex assigned at birth. Have you heard that phrase? Their sex assigned at birth. Well, have you ever thought about what the word assigned means? It means designated. Like I'm going to designate this or that. You're not assigned a sex at birth. You are a sex at birth. That's how simple that is. That's like going down to a lake. I'm going to assign that as water. I didn't assign it as water. It's water whether I assign it or not. And that's how stupid some of this it actually is. During the last several years, many have tried to make a difference between gender and sex, sex being male and female, gender masculine and feminine, sex being reference to the biological differences, the chromosomes, the hormonal profiles, and so on. Gender describing the characteristics of the society or culture delineates as masculine or feminine. This is, again, their definition of all this. And I mentioned here, this has not always been this kind of fluidity to these ideas. A few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, ABC News listed 58 gender options for Facebook. 58. And yet the Bible teaches, and we know by common sense, there are only two. There are only two. Male and female created he them. Sex, according to Debbie Herbnick, who would be an activist among the transgender people, sex refers mainly to biology and its configuration of chromosomes. Skipping down, gender is more about your personal sense of who you are, is what you want to be. And like my wife says, well, what if I just decide I want to be a cat? Does that make me a cat? Well, that's how crazy all of this is. Well, how do you know what you are? Well, it's by your sex. The simplest thing that DNA can tell you is whether someone is a male or female. And apart from some very rare cases that don't involve looking at the DNA sequence, all you need to know is whether they have an X and a Y chromosomes making them male, or a pair of X's which make them female. That's all. That's how simple all of that is. Well, all of this has led, this history behind all this, has led to moral anarchy, an abandonment of all semblance of Bible authority. I appreciated Brother Randy leading us in the singing right before our lesson. Do all in the name of the Lord. Whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord. All of that's thrown out the window with the transgender movement. It's a complete ignorance of what true Bible manhood and womanhood should be. Nothing more essential to our lives than our manhood or womanhood, because that's really what we are. And when people blur that and you're not really, you were born, your sex is a male, but if you prefer to be to be a feminine in gender, then, no, that's who you are. And to deny who you really are is to deny reality. And we live in this ethereal kind of gaseous atmosphere that nothing is held down, nothing is moored to the ground. As our culture embraces transgender identity, it uproots the very structure of our bodily existence, the reality of things. And to reject this reality will embrace chaos. And obviously God's way, God's word, and God's will are completely ignored when all of this is done. The transgender movement is actually moral perversion. Some claim God made them this way. Here I am born a male, but I just really want to be a female, and I think that's what God wants me to be, so somehow I've got to change it. God does not make people alcoholics. Now, I do not deny that people can have weaknesses for various things. When I was growing up, there was a girl, I remember this, for whatever reason, I was a pretty strapping young man even in kindergarten. And we had a girl, I won't call her name, some of you might know her, but she lived in the area. And she was more of a tomboy. She was all girl, but she was what we'd call a tomboy. And she could take me and sling me around like I remember in the playground being slung down by this girl. And she was a girl, but she had a lot of masculine ways about her, but she was still a girl. And I've known a lot of guys who carry themselves more like a female and hold their arms more like a female. That doesn't mean they're a female, but they may have some weaknesses, some feminine ways. And so I do not deny at all that there can be weaknesses on or some masculinity to females and some femininity to males. I don't deny that. But just because there may be some weaknesses that doesn't mean that we have to transgender and have surgery. God does not make men alcoholics. He doesn't make people adulterers. He doesn't make people sexual deviants. In 1982, I believe it was, I wish I had kept this book. I kept it for several years, didn't think I would need it, and got rid of it. I think I sold it at a bookstore. But it was a book on, and I took a course for education in adolescent psychology. And there were a number of chapters, and one chapter was on sexual deviancy. That was the name of the chapter. 1982, college class book, psychology course, sexual deviancy. I wish I still had that book. But sexual deviance, God didn't make people that way. By experimentation, sometimes home life, sometimes abuse. I was reading the other day about some young ladies who were absent father figures in their home life, and they never were really shown or told that they had worth just by being who they were, that they were valuable people, valuable young women, and they weren't told that, and they weren't treated like that, so they looked for it through prostitution. They looked for their value by being paid to, serve sex, basically. And so, yes, home life does have a part to it. It's not all of it, but it has a part to it. People can be abused. People can also experiment. We are so engrossed in our culture with things of a sexual nature so at our disposal, so easy, on the internet especially. And I was reading yesterday about how much pornography now is given over to all of this. It's just not man-woman. It's given over to pedophilia, given over to the homosexual activities, lesbian activities. And so it's accessible. And so people begin to think, well, I wonder about this. Or here's a girl who has not been treated really well at home. And here's a kind-hearted lady at work and begins to give her attention and gives her a time. And she draws closer and the attachment is there. And lo and behold, she becomes a lesbian. There are all kinds of reasons people become what they do, and none of it's right. None of it's right. I'm just saying that God did not make people that way. They can experiment, they can do a number of things to get into the position of having all kinds of sexual relations with anybody and anything. There can be birth defects, a hermaphrodite or intersex, or born with characteristics of both sexes. But there can be, we're saying there can be abnormalities at birth. But that can be solved by surgery. It can be solved by counseling if a person is willing to accept it. And there can be emotional imbalances, gender dysphoria, gender identity disorder, identify oneself with sex opposite to the birth, and anatomy. Again, all this can be solved by counseling if a person wants to. That's one thing I have also learned. You know, a person can have some weaknesses. And if they really believe in God and they really want to change and want to go to heaven, they can come out of their weaknesses. I was talking to a fellow who's roughly my age, who was a homosexual for a number of years. And I talked with him about some things, about what you did to get out of it. And he said, first, you got to want to get out of it. It's not going to come to you if you just, you enjoy where you are. If you enjoy where you are, that's the same way with an alcoholic or anyone else. If a person enjoys the mire of sin, being in all, then if he enjoys that, he's not going to get out of it. But if you see there's a better way, there is a hell to avoid and a heaven to win and a God to serve, then there is a way out. It can be overcome. Counseling can help and other things can help. Prayer can help. Reading the Bible, replacing activities with Bible reading, all of those things can help. Well, what can we do? I want to end with this tonight. It's similar to last week. We can practice, we can condone, we can support, we can uphold in every way what is biblically right. Do that. Know that the male and female, Genesis 1:27, that's all there is. And support that. Don't compromise. Be all behind that. And teach that, uphold it in every way. Recognize that eternal truths that we've been talking about in Genesis 1 and 2, relative to the roles of males and females, are not fluid. It's not, I was born a male, but I would like to be feminine. I'd like to do, no. And then tomorrow I think I'll change back. It's not fluid. It's not whatever a person wants himself or herself to be. It's what we are. And then we take what we have, what we're given at birth, and we do the very best we can with what we've got to work with. That's true in everything, isn't it? You take whatever you have, whatever is at your disposal. If you're tall, you're short, you're big, you're small, you're blonde or brunette, you're bald or you got hair, whatever your case is. We can't help our genetics. You take whatever you have that you got to work with and you serve God to the best of your ability with what you have. And God will be pleased with you. And then teach on these matters as we have opportunity. If we know someone at work, someone at school who is tottering along these lines, then hey, this, we're being bombarded by all sides, but this is the truth on the matter. This is the reality of the matter. And never compromise. Never compromise in vocabulary. Never compromise your faith on the matter. Never compromise your practice on the matter. Never compromise in family situations on the matter. That it is what it is. It's the truth of God, and we're not going to give in. And we're not going to call somebody whose name is Sharon, but she wants to be a boy, and we're going to call her they. we're going to call her her or by her name. We're not going to compromise on issues like that. We're not going to give in to the vocabulary of this movement. We're going to call people what they are and what they have. And then pray for our country. Pray for our people who are misguided, misinformed. And pray for them that they might come to an understanding of what the truth is on these matters. You've listened patiently. This is really not, I'm glad to be able to study this subject so I'll be a little bit more informed. I'm glad to preach on it. I was telling Lee, I'd much rather talk about truths of the Bible like the new birth we've been studying about in Genesis 3, or something about Jesus, or something in Paul's life, or something about the church. I had much rather talk about stuff like this, or that, than stuff like this. But it's a problem in our culture, and as Paul and Jesus and godly men of old dealt with societal issues that were about them, I think we must as well know what the truth of God is and how to deal with it. You listen patiently. If you're not a Christian, we hope you'll become one. I think most of us are. If there's something amiss in life that needs to be prayed about, confessed, repented of, we stand at the front for your help. If we can, let's stand and sing for our encouragement.